This show is brought to you in part with a grant from Hokoma's Sewing Center in Redding, California, and viewers like you.
Hello, and welcome to the Monkey Wrench Quilt Show. My name's Lorraine Dector. I'll be your guide through this exhibit of monkey wrench quilts. Quilting is a craft that's existed for many centuries. As far back as the Middle Ages, quilted clothes and bed covers were made by sewing together two layers of fabric with an inner layer of warmer material. The oldest known quilts were made in 1392, 100 years before Columbus came to America. While the technique of quilting has basically not changed much since its beginnings, innovations in technology have greatly sped up the process. The production of commercial batting by the middle of the 18th century helped in the creation of quilts as we know them today. American quilters have pieced together the stories of the country's history. We can learn a great deal by reading quilts from different time periods in America. During colonial times, taxes rose, political problems grew, and fabric became scarce. Quilts were made up of smaller pieces of fabric. When families left to settle the West, pioneer women brought their quilting with them. Quilts were used to keep them warm and serve as reminders of families left behind. The quilter's daily life inspired patterns that represented things in their lives. For example, the strong biblical influence is seen in pattern names such as Jacob's Ladder and Job's Trouble. The hardships pioneers endured can be seen in patterns with names like Rocky Road to California. The aspects of everyday life led to patterns with names such as Churn Dash and Log Cabin. Outdoor life can be seen in names such as Autumn Leaf, Spider Web, Rolling Stones, and Flying Geese. Politics influence pattern names like Whig Rose and 5440 or Fight, while occupations were represented by patterns such as anvil, sawtooth, the ship's wheel, and monkey wrench. By the late 1800s, over 4,000 quilt patterns were being circulated. In this show, we're going to take a look at just one of those old patterns, the monkey wrench. The monkey wrench block is typically based on a 4-patch, equal 9-patch, unequal 9-patch, or square and a square block. Other common names for the block include broken plate, churn dash, hole in the barn door, shoe fly, snail's trail, and square and compass. The variations in the design emerge from the block's numerous foundations. Two distinct versions, snail's trail and churn dash, are most frequently seen in this collection of monkey wrench quilt.
My mother made all my clothes and my sister's clothes and quilted very little. However, she did make a quilt for my daughter, her first granddaughter, when she was born.
I like to let the fabric move and twist and warp the way fabric does. I celebrate fabric, so I don't try to turn on the edges. I don't use anything fusible.
Most people that see this squirrel really want to go touch him because the fur is very lifelike.
Quilters coming up who will talk about their methods and their inspirations. But first, let's look at some conventional style monkey wrench quilts, and then later in this show, we'll see some monkey wrench art quilts and how they're made. Our first quilt is appropriately named Monkey Wrench. It comes from Evelyn Owens of Tallahassee, Florida. Evelyn made this quilt for her granddaughter, Rachel. She decided to make the monkey wrench because of her granddaughter's love of monkeys. And the flying geese piece strips were added on two sides because Evelyn loves birds. Rachel loves it, especially since Evelyn used her favorite colors of black and red for most of the quilt. The fabrics for Rachel's quilt are flannel, and it's machine quilted in invisible thread. The next quilt is called Churn Dash, aka Monkey Wrench, by Joan Middlebrook of Chico, California. Joan's quilt was made as a class project during one of Linda Ballard's mystery retreats. Linda had redesigned the Churn Dash or monkey wrench block so that the corner triangle squares are larger in proportion to the other parts of the block. Linda's design called for the 6-inch blocks to be set on point, Joan choosing a small burgundy print for the alternate blocks and a light background for the border. She created the applique border design by just laying the vine out by eye. Joan didn't mark her background fabric at all before starting to applique. She just did it as she went along. And then it was machine quilted. Let's take a look at Sharon's Garden by Sandra Miguel of Chico, California. She chose to make a memory quilt dedicated to Sharon Berg, the Honey Run quilt shop owner in Chico who died very suddenly. She also decided to use her churn dash or monkey wrench blocks, which had been given to Sandy for her birthday by the members of her small group. Sandy says that Sharon always reminded her of a flower garden, sharing her beauty with us all. In this quilt, she's surrounded by her many friends, as represented by the churn dash blocks. This fun SpongeBob quilt comes from Cinda Heron of Susanville, California. It was made as a Christmas gift for Cinda's 20-year-old son, Carl, a SpongeBob fan and a kid at heart. Cinda surprised both herself and Carl with the completion of this quilt. Using the SpongeBob novelty cotton print, Cinda matched solid colors to the print for the monkey wrench blocks. Each pieced block alternates with a square of the SpongeBob print. The pattern for this monkey wrench quilt is from Eleanor Burns' book, Trio of Treasured Quilts. The machine quilting was done in an overall pattern. I think many of us have thought about making a quilt out of ties. See how Christine Bjorklund of Redding, California used them to create a quilt called Bert's Tie, made to honor the memory of a friend who had passed away. First, Chris had to learn how to work with the ties, which are often made of fabrics that are difficult to work with. Next, she had to design a monkey wrench pattern for this quilt because all of the ready-made patterns she found were either too large or too small. Chris found that a book, Daddy's Ties by Shirley Botsford, was very helpful. This quilt is called 3-in-1 by Betty Lee Collins of Red Bluff, California, who explains its origins for us.
Hi, I'm Betty Lee Collins from Red Bluff, and I'm here to tell you about the traditional monkey wrench quilt that I made for my mother and for my grandmother in retrospect 6 years ago. And I had seen this quilt in Traditional Quilt magazine and knew it was the one I wanted to make for my mother to remind her of her mother, who was a quilter in our family. My grandmother, Eva Hill, lived in Eastern Oregon, and she quilted all through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And by the time I was a teenager, she had given up quilting. This quilt was meant for my mother's 80th birthday, and I chose colors and fabrics that I knew she would like and want in a quilt. And it is different from the original quilt in that respect. I call it the monkey wrench block. It is in the center in the medallion area of the quilt, and then is the bow tie, and then the border is made up of spools, like spools of thread. These were 3 blocks that my grandmother had made in quilts, never all together, but they're very traditional blocks from anywhere after the 1920s. They were very commonly made because you could do 1 block at a time with scrap fabrics until you had a stack of them, and then you could put your quilt together in any design you wanted.
Betty Lee pieced blocks of her mother's favorite colors, shades of pink, shades of brown, and muslin. And finally, Betty Lee hand-quilted the entire work in 1/4 inch outline, resulting in a quilt that echoes a heritage down the years and speaks across generations. Here's a unique quilt, a scrappy churn dash by Joyce Wall of Redding, California. This quilt came into being after a friend gave Joyce a small bag of scraps and then said, "Here, you like to work with small pieces." Joyce thought, what a neat gift for one quilter to give another. The scraps intrigued her. These weren't colors she would ordinarily choose. Since a few of the scraps had already been sewn into strips and half-square triangles, the churn dash pattern was the perfect choice to use. The finished blocks would be only 6 inches square because the scraps were small. Joyce trimmed the half-square triangles to the proper size and sewed more of the strips into the little rail fence components, making a few more of each component than she really needed. She arranged them on one end of the dining room table, and over the course of the next couple of weeks, whoever was sitting at the table would reach over and rearrange the pieces. At last, it was time to sew everything together. This quilt has special meaning for Joyce. The churn dash is one of her favorite patterns, along with the memories of the friend who gave her the little pieces of cloth and of her family as they helped with the process of arranging the block components. The intricate quilt, Liam's Beach, by Ginny McCombs of Redding, California, is next. Ginny learned to sew from her Swedish grandmother on a treadle sewing machine while she was an exchange student in Sweden 22 years ago. She loves designing and drawing, but she finds that she has so much more to master. For Liam's quilt, Ginny machine quilted a boat, a surfer, a skimboarder, and a child playing in the sand. She drew these herself to represent her son at different ages, his growing up, and the different interests he's had and will have. This quilt was made to wrap around Liam, hugging him even when she's not there to do it. She chose this pattern because they lived within walking distance to the beach, and she wanted him to always remember the sound of the waves. And here is the lovely Aurora Borealis quilt by Irene Stengel of Peanut, California. This is the snail's trail pattern and spiraling stars. The outer border block shade through 3 colors. Irene passed away in March of 2004. Her family, friends, and students will miss the heart she brought to all her relationships. Another quilt from Red Bluff, California comes to us from Babs Robinson. It's titled Court Jester, and as you can see, this is a fun quilt. This quilt was created as a personal challenge using printed fabrics from Babs' scrap bag and a pattern she hadn't previously tried. Scrappy prints of many colors were used in order to work with fabric she already had on hand. It evolved into a brightly colored autumn theme. The arrangement of the snail's trail blocks creates a design that tessellates, each interlocking to form dark, medium, and light images. Babs suggests that if you use the perspective of looking down at the top of the blocks, it gives the impression of jester hats viewed from above, with the black polka dots resembling tassels on the hats. Babs finished by hand quilting in an overall grid pattern. The quilts that you're about to see are from the American Quilter Society of Paducah, Kentucky. Most of these we'll look at are considered art quilts. This first one is named Harlequin by Gwenfie Reese Griffiths of Abergele, North Wales, United Kingdom. Although she's a traditionalist at heart, she has no wish to produce replicas and prefers to make her own contemporary style quilts. There's no particular overall theme or reason for her quilt choices, but making an Amish quilt has been on her want list for several years. When she discovered that the monkey wrench was a traditional Amish block, then she knew exactly what her next quilting project was going to be. With a medallion quilt, there's no need for a clear picture in mind ahead of time. The 9-patch grids were accurately drafted onto paper first. Then the lines of the monkey wrench block were lightly sketched in, and then the curves were all drawn into place with a compass. These blocks were hand-pieced, so for accuracy, a seam allowance was not added. To square the medallion center, flying geese traveling outward was her choice. The final design was 7 rows, with the geese getting bigger as they went outward. The freezer paper method was used, cutting the shapes with a seam allowance slightly larger than a 1/4 inch, allowed for slight errors in placement. After the corners were stitched to the center, the piece was pinned to a design wall. A pleasant 3-dimensional effect was observed, with the flying geese appearing to emerge from behind the center panel. The hand quilting is as important as any other part of the process. The navy background of the 3 different size blocks formed interesting shaped spaces, ideal for hand quilting. And the feather patterns enhanced the Amish effect. The flying geese were quilted in the ditch. The binding is cerise. To brighten it, a strip of lime green was tacked in place and bound. Then the edge was scalloped every 1/2 inch by hand. Now on to aptly named Monkey Business by Sherry Bain Driver of Centennial, Colorado. She is crazy about quilts and loves every step of making them, from the initial idea to the final stitch and the binding, even the basting. She designs on the computer, a quick way to try numerous ideas. After initial sketches are made in a program, incomplete designs may be printed out so that more intricate details can be drawn in unfinished areas by hand. iCat fabrics are used. The designs on these fabrics are created by wrapping warp and/or weft threads to resist dyes before weaving. The edges of the blocks on point inspired the addition of a zigzag border. Zigzags and stripes are favorite motifs of Sherry's, so they were sketched in too. She never worries about the design being limited by her sewing capabilities. You can enjoy the sense of movement added by the elongated snail's trail blocks. The computer printout made it apparent that the spaces between the blocks could be filled with large and small churn dashes. The large white triangle of the snail's trail called for some extra attention. A striped fabric for that patch accentuated the illusion of spinning. With a little math, it was determined that diagonally set 5-inch and 10-inch churn dash and snail's trail blocks needed a wide border to reach the required size. But serendipitously, that offered the space for a zigzag border. The final design focused on 4 dark snail's trail arms surrounding a small churn dash. The 4 center snail's trails were sewn first and pinned to the design wall. Patches for the churn dash blocks were cut and evaluated for color and value, with the triangles of the small churn dash matching the purple snail's trail. They merged to disguise the edges of the 2 blocks, adding to that sense of movement. Visual sensations of movement in quilt layouts really brings the end results to life. This next lively quilt is Pinwheels and Whirligigs by Sue Turnquist of Kalamazoo, Michigan. Her quilts tend to have a life of their own and often evolve in unique ways. Seldom, if ever, has a quilt turned out exactly like the original design. This quilt was the first time Sue worked with a snail's trail pattern block. Starting from scratch, quilt software was used to create the basic block in grayscale. She started with a pinwheel in the center, then added blocks out to the periphery. Thus, as the design grew, the illusion of pinwheels and whirligigs was created. Numerous different blocks were tried as connectors for the larger whirligig blocks. The diagonal strip block was settled on because it offered the illusion of framing, sashing, or cross-hatching within the central medallion. When designing a project that requires free-form piecing, such as the setting corners in this quilt, she likes to start with a large piece of white paper cut to the exact finished size. The design is drawn for one piece, then a light table is used to trace the other pieces. Registration marks are added to the paper templates to facilitate reassembly. The inner and outer borders use strips that were crossed and strip-pieced. The snail's trail blocks in the middle border and the wood and basket weave boxes were all done with paper piecing. The papers for each corner were cut apart and used as templates, and a spray adhesive was used to apply them to the back of the fabric. The free-form pieces were assembled with the aid of a light box, and then they were joined with invisible thread and a tiny zigzag top stitch. Ruche flowers were added to the center of each whirligig to enhance the illusion. They were constructed with tubes of gold batik, which were marked at half-inch intervals, then basted from one mark to the next while alternating sides. The thread was pulled to a crinoline foundation. After the excess foundation was trimmed, the finished flower was applied to the whirligig with a central bead and heavy-duty bead thread. This next one is called Caution, Zebra Crossing, and it's by Maggie Ball from Bainbridge Island, Washington State. Born and raised in the north of England, she moved to the United States in 1983. She enjoys the endless design possibilities as well as the pleasure of sharing common interests with other quilting enthusiasts. Her quilt title has a double meaning and originally was going to be simply Zebra Crossing, a type of special road crossing marked with striped poles. But she realized that most Americans are not familiar with zebra crossings. Then a friend suggested adding caution into the title to provide a hint. A lattice quilt, The basic concept is to divide simple quilt blocks with lattice fabric combinations and separate them with the narrow lattice strips. For this quilt, wide sashing strips were split between the blocks, making a double sash. Miniature blocks were used for the outer cornerstones of the quilt, and prairie points were added to pep up the borders. The 9 blocks are strictly organized and balanced. However, with the sashing, red rectangles were added adjacent to the intersections. This created more monkey wrenches that crossed the boundaries of the blocks. The quilt follows a basic pattern of 9 9-patch blocks, which are fragmented by narrow lattice strips and separated by sashing. In the center field of the quilt is a large monkey wrench sewn in black and silver twisted thread superimposed over all the blocks. The outer edge of the monkey wrench is defined with a double stitching line, and parallel lines follow the rectangles and triangles of the pattern. Silver thread was used in the red border, adding more triangles to continue the peaks created by the prairie points and perpetuate the triangle theme. The back of the quilt is pieced with a large monkey wrench block 36 inches square. The side panels provide the extra breadth and width needed to complete this side. The next quilt is called by the intriguing name Wheel of Fortune, and it was made by Christine N. Brown and Renee Howell of Centennial, Colorado. Christine's found that quilting has enriched, expanded, and challenged her world. The title alludes to the uncertainty and unpredictability that march with us through life. None of us can choose how life will treat us or where that Wheel of Fortune will stop, but we can choose how we respond to new directions and changes. For Renee, her fascination started from the moment she first began to sew. The rhythm of needle, thread, and bobbin made her dream of some project, someday, that would need a lot of thread lines and seams to complete. So it was her fortune to discover the creative world of quilting. Creating visual movement and an interesting composition is Christine's goal in design. She chose the snail's trail version of monkey wrench and set about drafting this block into an elongated and elegant 60-degree diamond. This would offer more options and help translate a square block into the circular vision that the wheel-like design would require. The central part of the design came together quickly. What was created was a visual circle that could only be framed with another circle. A quarter circle, the actual size needed, was drafted, and then a template was made. After completing the outer pieced ring, the square center medallion was trimmed into a circle shape, and the seam allowances were added, and then the 2 circles were pieced together. Drafting the monkey wrench within a 60-degree diamond adds narrow angles and puts a different spin, literally and figuratively, on the blocks when joined. 6 blocks of one color combination were made for the inner medallion, then 6 in another combination for the outer medallion. Then the blocks were pieced with set-in seams. And finally, corners were added to turn the completed hexagon into a square. One Thing Leads to Another by Ann Feidelson of Montague, Massachusetts. She attended the 1971 Whitney Museum exhibit, Abstract Design in American Quilts, with her mother. And from the outset, she knew quilts as both comfort and art. The monkey wrench block didn't inspire her initially, but she believes any block or pattern can be a vehicle for exciting colors or interesting compositions. It's color and shape and the dynamic forces they create that carry meaning. She likes simple blocks and compositions and simple quilting, but not simple colors, preferring complex, vibrant hues and the richness of low-contrast blends. She often likes blocks in which the colors are so close that you hardly see the piecing. For small bits of fabric, she relies on subscriptions to 10-inch squares and fat 16ths. Anne likes getting fabric in the mail that she wouldn't have chosen in a store. Colors flow closely in many places, yet arrive somewhere with dramatic surprise. Sometimes this flow is created by using the same fabric in the inner triangles of one block and in the outer triangles of the neighboring block. Then the inner triangles of the second block are in the outer triangles of a third block, and so on. While the blocks may be progressing in a sequence of colors in one direction, The centers may be progressing in a sequence of colors in another direction. A 3-color block is infinitely more exciting than a 2-color block. Rarely using preparatory drawings or sketches, she prefers to compose as she progresses. About half again as many blocks were made as are in the final quilt. Those were edited out during the process of refining the color ranges. But like sourdough bread, leftovers can rise again for the next quilt. And the next quilt to rise to the occasion is the very colorful Razzle Dazzle by Mary Ann Herndon of Spring, Texas. Art in almost any form has always been a major focus for Mary Ann, and all her ideas for quilt designs could not possibly be completed in many lifetimes. Although inspired by seeing the works of other quilt makers, she's found that more original ideas come from viewing other art forms, such as paintings, illustrative art, children's book illustrations, and glass art. For the most part, the quilts she makes are intended for competitions. Like most quilters, she started making traditional quilts and learning basics. Making a quilt with 25 blocks that are all the same at first didn't seem much fun. But attempting to turn a traditional block into a complex art piece was inspiring. The overall impact of a quilt is the most important aspect of the piece to Mary Ann. The first view that makes you catch your breath and say, wow, is very important. The pattern was redrafted into a diamond shape rather than a square and paper pieced. To plan the setting, the diamonds were photocopied with the redrafted monkey wrench pieces, which were shaded in black and white in varying positions. The blocks were cut out, then moved around and placed in several settings. She wanted a setting that resulted in radiating patterns rather than separate blocks. With a metallic print already purchased, a trip to several quilt shops resulted in a shaded material, which provided an effect that would have been harder to achieve with graduated separate pieces. The next step was to decide the shading sequence from the middle to the outside. Then the diamond was enlarged to the size calculated for the quilt and photocopied. Each diamond was made to indicate colors, because paper piecing, a radiating pattern that gradually changes colors, can get confusing. The feeling of a lack of time for most quilters is rather universal. So many possible quilts, so little time. This fascinating quilt is called Two Friends Monkeying Around by Chris Lynn Kirsch and Sharon Rhodes of Mosinee, Wisconsin. From childhood, Chris has enjoyed working and creating with fabric. After several years as an interior decorator, she met her first quilters, drawing her and her trusty sewing machine in new directions. Through quilting, she likes pushing the limits on color arrangement and often attempts to break out of the expected. Art quilts are attractive because of the design opportunities they present, but she still admires the beauty and workmanship of traditional quilts and likes to retain some elements of the traditional in her work. Sharon was not impressed with the monkey wrench design at first. The beauty of a partnership is that bizarre ideas are tempered with more rational thought and discussion. They wanted the quilt to have a strong overall visual effect, yet have it draw you in with interesting details. This was accomplished with the large dramatic blocks followed by the circular design of the quilting, and finally noting the monkey shapes and monkey wrench block motifs. After all this, they finally got their monkeys with wrenches. The simple design allowed the opportunity to explore new directions in creative quilting. To balance the straight lines of the piecing, they both began thinking of curves, and they both loved the beauty of the flowing oriental circular designs. They still liked the monkeys with wrenches theme, and why not? After some trial and error, they produced several recognizable monkeys. With a computer scanner, the drawings were enlarged or reduced to scale as needed. Remembering the childhood joy of cutting paper dolls, they simply stapled the pattern to a stack of paper and cut out monkeys. Soon monkeys were everywhere and in all sizes. Quilting was done in metallic, rayon, and variegated threads. Trapunto surrounded with stippling added extra relief to the dominant monkey circle. Is this monkey wrench? Is the question asked by the name of this next quilt, made by Marlene Silha Martin of Danville, Kentucky. She started quilting about 4 years ago and loves trying new ideas and techniques. Her very supportive husband, Bob, joked that being with a quilter is like living with a large dog that sheds thread. Marlene sometimes feels like the monkey in the old saying, "Monkey see, monkey do." She strongly identified with the monkey in this quilt, contemplating a tool and wondering if it's correct for the job. She always designs in color on the computer to start, but then prints blocks and quilt designs in shades of black and white. Knowing the design and color values ahead of time frees her to play with color in fabric. The color choices are influenced by her background of sewing for clothing, so she has a tendency to use similar values. As blocks are pieced, they're added to the design wall. After several experiments during the layout design phase, she noticed that curving certain sections of the block changed the look from a monkey wrench to a standard wrench. Blocks were added to the pattern and colors changed to make the quilt look like there were multiple wrenches, yet arranged so the viewer could still see the original monkey wrench block. Although one could see that this was a variation, it no longer looked like the traditional block, hence the title, "Is This a Monkey Wrench?" Once the layout was decided, she began piecing from the black and white design. The border was shaped to add visual interest and interpret the block. Then bolts were added along with the other monkey wrench blocks. The monkey itself was drawn, then fused to muslin and appliqued to the quilt with freehand stitching after the quilting was complete. The monkey was left as a representation rather than an exact likeness. Eyelash trim seemed perfect for the hair around the monkey's face. Couching along the quilt and on the border helped to add further texture. The entire work was machine pieced and quilted on her home sewing machine. The technique used was primarily free motion quilting. The inviting name of the next quilt is Shall We Dance? By Maureen Roy of Edmonds, Washington. She enjoys the challenge of trying new ideas and concepts in design. Some ideas come easy and turn into quilts quickly, while others have to simmer a while before the idea becomes clear enough to work on. Once you step into the world of quilting, you find there are no limitations, either on your creativity or your depth of feelings. Maureen's one strict rule is to finish every quilt top she starts. She made quite a few blocks with different fabrics, looking for inspiration. Finally, she decided on a black background with her hand-dyed fabrics. Several blocks were made, some with the pattern reversed. These were then played with until a pattern emerged. As the blocks were randomly placed on the designing wall, she noticed that the blue-green gradation formed a square. As the blues formed a square, so did the red gradation. The dark blue triangle on the block was not vivid enough and got lost, so it was substituted with a commercial fabric to put some pizzazz in the quilt. With this addition, the square seemed to pop out. She's developed a paper placing technique, substituting freezer paper with a very fine, soft interfacing that could be left in. Since she has arthritis in her thumbs, it's painful to remove the freezer paper, and this soft interfacing works wonderfully well. The fun and the challenge were playing with the regular and reverse blocks to bring out the pattern envisioned. Another tricky part was figuring out which way the tails would face. The center worked better with the tails all in the same direction, giving it movement. Initially, Shall We Dance was designed without much thought to the border. The center worked better with the tails all in the same direction, giving it movement. After experiments with several borders, this one seemed to unify the whole quilt. She grew to enjoy the obsessive focus on the placement of the blocks. When it was finished and hanging in the living room, she imagined a magical evening with dancers twirling around a dance floor, hence the name, Shall We Dance? Sometimes a quilt develops a scope and story almost epic in nature. Let's watch as Ann Horton of Redwood Valley, California, shows us her quilt called Summer's Salute to Amelia.
I'm Ann Horton. I'm from Northern California. I live in a mountaintop house in Redwood Valley, California. The quilt has some significance to me personally, so I want to mention a couple things about that. My grandmother, or actually my great-great-grandmother, Amelia Cawley, immigrated to the United States and onto a farm in Illinois in 1870. And I grew up on that same farm several generations later. To construct a quilt, I had to first of all figure out, okay, I have monkey wrench blocks in the old quilt, but I want them to be in the new quilt as well. And so I started with the sky. I pieced a lot of sky fabrics into the swirling breeze going on up there, and those are all, there's some 30, 40 monkey wrench blocks up in that sky. And then I built the background with the mountains and our meadows. The fun part was what I was going to do with this little quilt, and the split rail fence is actually part of our orchard as well. My husband and I had built this split rail fence several years ago with a lot of sawing and nailing and putting it into place, and so I thought I can do the same thing with a quilt, right? So I started by taking a piece of heavy felt, and I started just ripping and tearing pieces of wood-like fabric in a lot of different shades. And I probably should mention that as a quilter, I tend to put at least 100 or more different fabrics in every quilt that I make. I tore, and there's a lot of raw edges. If you look close at this, lots of pieces of frayed thread coming off. If you run your hand across our split rail fence, you'll get a sliver. So that's exactly what I wanted to capture in that. And I had a lot of fun. I actually even embroidered nail heads onto the boards here and the rails because I wanted it to look very authentic. And I actually laid this quilt over the rail like it would be if it was really out in our orchard, and then fixed it all down into place. My grandmother and my great-grandmother, they had all grown hollyhocks on our farm. And when we moved to our mountain home, we immediately planted hollyhocks. The hollyhocks are all made up, again, of many, many different purples, pinks, reds, and they're layered, put down, and then hand-beaded around each of the centers. I do a lot of beading in my quilts. I actually look at my quilts as like little treasure troves. The ground around our orchard was very tangled with wildflowers and insects and a variety of things. In fact, my quilt has a snail. I had fun with this because it is also called Snail Trail, this block. The monkey wrench block has two names. So I had to have a little snail crawling off the block onto a piece of wood. I also use a lot of machine embroidery in this, and these fabulous little flowers are part of the machine embroidery work. They actually stick out at probably 3/4 of an inch. The squirrel is a thread-painted piece that I worked on. Most people that see this squirrel really want to go touch him because the fur is very lifelike. It takes layers and layers and layers of threads laid over top of one another to create this kind of detail. I'd like my quilts to tell a little bit of a story, or at least suggest one. This quilt tells a lot of stories for me, but for the viewer it also talks about how this little guy probably was up here grabbing some plums off the tree not too long ago. And again, it suggests the life that goes on in our home and in our orchards. I'm very pleased with it. I think my great-great-grandmother would be very pleased with it too.
Well, our next quilt, called Stripes, Dots, and Friends, was made by Lucy Silliman of Fort Scott, Kansas. With quilting, there's always a new way to solve problems and new challenges. While there's nothing really new in working on an old design favorite, there can always be new twists or variations on an old standard. Lucy's decided that no one else will want all of her many beloved, unusual fabrics, so her mottos become, use the best first. And no fabric is too beautiful or valuable to be spared from the scissors. She has worked hard locating and purchasing all of these beauties and delights in the sumptuous and effective eye candy they provide. Cutting and experimenting with the colors is the most fun of all. Black and white with a huge infusion of red is a very graphic color combination. The starkness of the black and white is quickly offset by the vibrancy of the hot red. 25 fabrics were selected to form the center design. When she was sure of the arrangement, each fabric was assigned a number. The blocks were then paper pieced, after which the color number of each piece was written on the paper. Starting near the center of the quilt, As each block was sewn, it went on the design wall to ensure that the twisting of the design still matched the mental image of the original idea. The centers of each design were very large and ugly. What to do? Since Lucy had always been fascinated by Celtic design, it seemed blending something old and something new was the answer. She decided that using chenille strips would help. She made 3 1 1/4 inch bias strips of the base color, topped with 2 3/4 inch bias strips of the top color. Stacking these together, she sewed the middle with a short stitch length. Being careful not to cut into the stitching, she clipped to the center line on both sides of the strip. With her next step, the knot was enlarged to the correct size. Pinning the paper pattern to an ironing board, the knots were woven onto it, and then they were starched and pressed to keep their shape. Once they were cool and stiff, she then sewed the knots to the quilt. This next quilt is like good news. It's called Black and White and Red All Over, and it's by Judy Sohn of Seattle, Washington. Constantly inspired and challenged by other quilts, she enjoys designing original works, but also likes recreating a pattern for an admired quilt. Trying her hand at all kinds of techniques, she may only try something once, but finding out she can achieve it is rewarding in itself. Its flexibility is just a part of why quilting is such a wonderful artistic medium. She decided to use the 2 designs most strongly associated with this block, which are the Snail's Trail and the Churn Dash designs. With computer software, Judy tried several methods of combining both designs in one block and settled on superimposing one block over the other. Every other patch was colored red, and the remaining patches either black or white, depending on their position in the snail's trail. Thus, the 2 blocks would appear to be woven together. The perfect title came to her when she remembered the old grade school riddle. What is it that's black and white and red all over? A newspaper. The blocks were foundation paper pieced, requiring 3 different units per block. The center unit has 2 individual triangles that are attached after the rest of the center unit is sewn. The corner square block is paper pieced with 2 different units. The sashing and corner squares were pieced to form monkey wrenches between and around the blocks. For the sashing, 42 inch by 1.5 inch strips were cut and sewn into strip sets. The color combinations of half the strip sets are black, white, black, and the other half of them are white, black, white. These sets were then placed, forming monkey wrench variations in the cornerstones. On the back of the quilt, a large monkey wrench block was pieced with curved seams. And we see the wonderful black and white newspaper print she found for the background. Lastly, she hand-quilted a fan design with a red pearl cotton thread over the entire work. The stories of ships sailing on water seems to draw the imagination of many quilters. Let's see how the challenge of capturing the colors and experiences of sailing is met by our next quilt, Safe Harbor, by Patricia Dowling of Callahan, Florida. Her quilts are simple, traditional designs reflecting a down-to-earth nature. Her quilts have been made for family members and even the family pets. Her walls are insulated with quilts throughout the house, so they're called wall warmers. Even her bed has a different quilt for every month of the year. She uses 3 computer programs for laying out colors and making changes, but patterns are drafted by hand, with measurements calculated precisely. Rotary cutters are wonderful tools when you take your time and make exact cuts. No need to rush. As the old saying goes, measure twice and cut once. The first drawing of the monkey wrench block, when turned on its point, resembled water. A boat harbor came to mind because the water looks so rough. After a few blocks were completed and placed on the design wall, she decided to move a half square down in each row and liked the design better. Then the entire quilt was drawn to scale with simple ships in the harbor. The churn dash pattern was used for the stars to guide the ships to harbor. Both the city background in yellow cloth and the blue moon were fabrics from scraps. And for luck, 7 flags were added to the masts of the sailing ships. Then many different designs were machine quilted throughout the work. Every quilt has a story, and when the story is told, the quilt is finished. Sometimes, like a fine painting, a quilt can take us away from the here and now. Sometimes it's a fabric landscape taking us back to an idyllic location. Or like this Escape from Skagway, a geological retreat made from whole cloth. We asked Laura Fogg of Ukiah, California to explain its origin and development.
My name's Laura Fogg. I'm a quilter from Northern California. I live in Ukiah. This quilt is called Escape from Skagway. This quilt was started on a cruise with my father. I went up the Inside Passage with him last summer on a 2-week cruise, and I knew I was going to get bored stiff because I don't play bridge and I don't do snowball bingo. So I brought a lot of my fabric with me because I'd been to Alaska before, loved it, and thought, this time I'm going to do art. So I brought the fabric. I didn't bring a sewing machine, but I brought a lot of pins. And I set up at a rear deck on the ship, and I was able to kind of claim this table for myself. I stayed and was able to make quilts just looking out the window. In Skagway, I decided to go on shore, and it was a little teeming town full of tourists. I walked about 2 miles out of town and found a cemetery. Beyond the cemetery, I found a sign that pointed to a waterfall. I walked up to the waterfall, and there it was. I didn't have anything to sketch with. I didn't have my camera. I just sat there and looked at it for half an hour. And then I came back to the ship, and while other people were still out shopping, I sat down with my fabric and started creating the center panel, the background part of this whole waterfall scene. I do a lot of collage. I use many, many, many different pieces of fabrics, both the front side and the back side. And what I started with was a piece of batting fabric that was backside down on the table, put some cotton batting over the top of that, and then kind of used that like my white canvas. I was a painter, and I still do my quilting in a very much painterly style. So working with bigger pieces of fabric into more and more detail from the background towards the foreground, I started laying in the dark colors up here that were the background in this rainforest. I like to let the fabric move and twist and warp the way fabric does. I celebrate fabric, so I don't try to turn on the edges. I don't use anything fusible. I don't want it to be flat like cardboard. So if the fabric doesn't move naturally while I'm quilting it, I'll actually take a pin and shove it around a little bit. If you can see, there's little buckles, and it gets a dimensionality. I just folded that leaf over the way a leaf will fold in nature. Then I went back into the waterfall. I was feeling it was too dark with the black tulle over it, and I wanted to get that feeling of water just coursing over the rocks and falling so far. So I cut vertical stripes out of from the tulle so that the whiter water would show through. I did all of this quilting here in silver thread to try to catch the light and get that feeling of sparkle that there is in flowing water. These ferns here are completely three-dimensional. They're not even tacked onto the quilt entirely. They're just loose. So when the quilt moves or when a little bit of breeze blows, they actually move like the ferns in the forest would. And here we have these giant, I think they're Queen Anne's lace, the flowers that were all over Alaska at that time of the year. And they were soft and white and fluffy and very dimensional. So I found some old chenille yarn that somebody gave me and took 2 strands of it and wrapped it around the point of my sewing scissors, and then would just slip down a little lump of it and then drive all over it with the sewing machine. And I used a green variegated thread in that because there was kind of a messy green look inside every little blossom on the flowers. And then without cutting it, I'd move to the next place and make a little pile and sew it down. So I got all those flowers in there. And I wanted this feeling of the little whirlpools where the water bashes into the rocks. And that wasn't enough. I put tulle. There's a sparkly tulle here and all along here that shows, again, it's the spray. It's messy, but nature is messy. I like to celebrate that. And just let this ragged stuff kind of hang out here and give that feeling that there's motion and energy, and it's a dynamic piece of art. So finally, over here, the most foreground element is these bigger Queen Anne's lace flowers. And I did them the same way as I did the smaller ones, but used more strands of chenille and tried to make them in more detail so they would stand out. And I'm always interested in perspective. I like to have people feel like there's a great depth to my pieces. So I exaggerated the size of these things that were in the foreground so somebody could walk by, I hope, and feel like they're just standing there right in front of the waterfall.
This next quilt has the musical name Quartet in Mosaic and is a performance by Karen Griska of Nashville, Tennessee. The design process of discovering new techniques, handling the fabrics, all leading to a stunning finished product, fuels her passion for quilting. Each quilt she makes generates more ideas. Quartet in Mosaic was improvised as she went along, the only image in mind ahead of time being one very large monkey wrench. That evolved as it progressed into 4 fairly large blocks. Once the blocks were made, the background was filled with a broken tile of dark plum, ironed on with fusible web. A thrilling, high-contrast effect was achieved with the red center squares. This classic element in many traditional log cabin quilts was right at home here. The red squares called for some red sashing of the same width. The ironed-on sawtooth triangles in the border were inspired by the half-square triangles in the monkey wrenches. This made the blocks stand out nicely. The wavy vertical machine quilting lines were made with smoke-colored monofilament threads, making them quietly visible in the light gold areas, but not too shiny in the monkey wrench or red areas. In a mosaic quilt, the pieced or whole cloth top can be the background or grout for the quilt design. It's good to experiment with tiles of different color, value, and size. Tiles made of a variety of fabrics, including some from printed materials, add interest and excitement. Fabrics that look like china plates are fun to use in mosaic. Precision is not an important objective here. When you see mosaic work in the future, notice the degree of precision, or lack thereof, and the resulting effect. Mosaic would probably not be a good choice for a utility quilt. This is art, and we don't expect all art to be machine washable. Mosaic quilts are more like crazy quilts or novelty quilts in this regard. And now, destined to be our last quilt for this show is Kismet. We'll see how Christina Chase Strom of Glendale, Ohio, arrived at it. Though not a part of her family tradition, quilt making has long been one of her dreams, almost as far back as she can remember. She has an abiding fondness for the churn dash style variation on the monkey wrench because this was the pattern used in her first full-size quilt. After several weeks of frenzied work and still no great masterpiece had appeared, Christina woke one morning filled with a joyous feeling of renewal. By sunset, a design for the quilt emerged complete with a name that magically entered her mind during the course of the day: Kismet. First, she had to isolate the individual fragments and determine how many were required, as well as organize the color configurations of each unit. Second, the most efficient construction for the separate components had to be found. And third, she had to develop a plan for joining the finished blocks. She computer drafted a line drawing to accurately determine the exact size. This allowed strip piecing 2 color strata to construct these units. Templates were made for the surrounding triangles. After assembly line sewing all similar units, the blocks were complete and on the design wall. From the moment the master working guide was pasted up, she noticed that a secondary parquetry leg design was created by the white spaces. While working on the top, she kept thinking about this unexpected element. Though she thought her shaggy chic adventure was over, that element proved to be the solution. Fortunately, the outside edges of the blocks had not been squared. Assembling the 84-inch quiltlets was an exercise in making Y and inset seams. Any fears she had about these sometimes tricky techniques were eradicated forever. After joining each unit, she fringed the exposed seams by cutting at scant half-inch intervals. The borders were constructed separately before connecting them to the body of the quilt. For binding, slightly larger than usual strips attached in the French manner were used. Washing the quilt several times enhanced the frayed edges. At last, Kismet was complete, and Christina vowed never to question destiny again. Quilt making has a long and illustrious story in America, and it's woven into the fabric, as it were, of our collective culture and history. Some people believe this conventional block pattern became the symbol of freedom in our country's early quilt-making history. It said slaves in America's southern states developed a code that involved quilt patterns as part of the Underground Railroad. Quilts featuring a succession of different blocks were hung outdoors during daylight to signal escape plans to other slaves. Different patterns were given different meanings, and the slaves committed those patterns to memory in the form of a poem. For example, one of the lines from the poem stated, "The monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada on the Bear's Paw Trail to the crossroads." It was up to the refugee slave to remember the meaning of each pattern. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope we've inspired you to pick up your needle and thread and start quilting your family history today.
Crawl under my dream quilt. Get familiar with this thing I've built. I used a needle and thread, yellow, blue, and red in my dream quilt. Fall into this dream. Come on, together we can make a perfect scene. Got a lot of stars on my block. Come on and let's go for a walk in my dream. Come on, let's walk now. We'll take a drunkard's path to a lady on the lake. We'll send a New York beauty on a wild goose chase. Watch that streak of lightning hit the cabin in the pines. The bear paw, the goose track, the fourth batch, and the ninth in my dream. Woo! A place where you can let your colors scream. On your little machine, purple, orange, and green in my dream. Come on, and don't forget your quarter-inch seam allowance.
This show is brought to you in part with a grant from Hokuma's Sewing Center in Redding, California, and viewers like you. As you've just seen, the monkey wrench quilt pattern has been used in new and exciting ways for centuries. If you enjoyed this walk through the world of monkey wrench quilting, KIXE is proud to offer you the entire program on DVD or VHS home video for your viewing pleasure. The cost is $19.95 plus tax, shipping, and handling. Call 800-655-0099 to order your copy of Monkey Wrench Quilts today.